Welcome to Stephen Foster at 200, a companion podcast to the edited volume, Stephen Foster at 200, a Critical Reappraisal. I'm Jason Lee Guthrie, here with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Jennie Lightness-Goff.
For this first episode, we wanted to invite our editor, Robin James, to ask us some questions about the background of the project and why we wanted to write about Stephen Foster in 2026.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I edit the music, media, and communications list at Palgrave, and my own background is in philosophy and popular music studies.
That's one of the reasons that we were really excited to work with you, because your background reflects so much of what we were hoping to inject into the project. We do have a lot of musicologists, Department of Music scholars, but neither Jennie nor myself are among them. I'm in mass communication, she's in English.
So since this is the first episode, I just wanted to ask briefly, who is Stephen Foster and why should we care about him in 2026?
I think we should care about him because he is manifestly influential in American music in many ways. Several of the chapters in our volume kind of problematize this idea of him as the father of American music, or interrogate that a little bit further. But if you mean father in the sense of for better or for worse, then it's maybe a little bit more apt. That phrase can really be historically flattening, I think. But certainly a lot of the complexity and contradiction that is housed in American music can be seen at its genesis there before the Civil War, and especially in the early career of Stephen Foster.
I'm a person that's been accused of canceling Foster a couple of times, but I'm the person who's actually most comfortable with the term father of American music in this project. In fact, in my episode, I'll talk about why I like that term. But I think in some ways it is a political term in the same way that founding fathers is a political term. And I don't think the existence of the term founding fathers has made it harder for people to be critical of that founding generation. In fact, it's made it more possible because of our own vexed relationship to fathers. We have a lot of terms for deadbeat dads, and some of us a lot of people did feel politically abandoned by a project of freedom that did not include them. I'm not uncomfortable with that term at all. The term can be flattening, but it also shows some of our ambivalence towards our influences.
Yeah, for sure.
Cultural space, political space, yeah.
And I also think, too, about, this is, again, be the philosopher, thinking about the figure of the patriarch, property owner, the connection between these two. And the father figure is a great way to embody how the father has been the figure of the property owner in Western political philosophy, Western culture. So tell me a bit about, how did you get the idea for the project? How did it come together?
Sure. My interest came out of necessity of needing to complete a dissertation. Like I said, I'm from mass communication, not in ethnomusicology, but was in bands in my 20s. Eventually decided that I wanted a little bit more stable employment and financial situation, so I decided to go back to grad school and decided I wanted to do some work on the history of copyright, something I was always interested about. Being an independent musician, this seemed like the one aspect of managing your own career that was just so nebulous. I can't wrap my mind around this, and I think a lot of creative people feel that way. So we started looking into it, wanted to look at the beginning of American copyright, and looked at a few different figures. Benjamin Franklin as the author and journalist, Matthew Brady as the most remembered photographer of Civil War photos, but also looked at Stephen Foster. And the first thing I pulled off the shelf, this would have been maybe 2014, 2015, was the Ken Emerson biography, Doodah. I think it's pretty well done. It's probably the best major biography, I would say, that's out there. It was fine to kind of help orient me to Stephen Foster and what was going on. I think a fair way to characterize Ken's tone about racial representation in Foster is it's problematic and it's not my main point for this biography. Mm-hmm. Then from there, I start looking into other literature, And one of the first things that I found was Jennie's 2008 article on Foster's supposed conversion narrative, the story of how he changed his views on race over time. I think that essay is really important to this project even, because it is still a debated topic. In the middle of working on my dissertation, the most recent biography of Foster came out in 2016 by Joanne O'Connell. I think is maybe even generous to say backtracks on the criticism of Foster's racial representation from the Emerson book. At one point, she has a line that Stephen was anti-slavery in his heart. You just couldn't speak up in the 1850s, yada, yada, whatever. And I think reading that and asking the question of, wow, why are we still arguing whether this is racist? It can be important, it can be influential, and also be racist. That, for me, was a big origin of the project. And I kind of talked Jennie into hopping on, thankfully, because she's just has already been so influential in helping to shape that conversation.
So this is a really nice thing to hear, that it was influential, because it, in some ways, broke my academic career in half. It came out about 6 months before I did my qualifying exams for a PhD. So yeah, I peaked too soon. I was thinking about writing a dissertation about the history of minstrelsy and performance. And basically I submitted that article, and it's a response to this 2005 tribute album to Stephen Foster, Beautiful Dreamer, which I literally heard while screening wedding music, because I got married that year as well. Also a prodigy in that regard, though it's lasted. So basically, my mom had sung Jeannie with the light brown hair because of my name. And so I wrote this article because after reading Ken Emerson's biography and a number of other pieces of musical history, I just didn't understand where to place Foster in a kind of canon. And I think the problem with the father of American music category is that it often means that he has no antecedents, he's singular. And I thought, okay, no, this man has relationship to other literature, other histories, right? And so what I was trying to do, essentially, as a literary scholar, was to put him in conversation with writers. And the person I landed on was Mark Twain, because Mark Twain similarly had this bulletproof vest on for a long time in American literary studies. There was always a debate about Huck Finn, of course, about the racial content of Huck Finn. And there was a desire to find Mark Twain in Huck and Huck in Mark Twain. And I realized a lot of that critical desire is a person's desire to find some kind of neutral political object. I really just started thinking about these two people in conversation with one another. And so it's so strange to me that at first it had difficulty going through peer review. And I'll never forget, one of the peer readers wrote, "The writer thinks that he's a very clever boy." It's a blind review, right? They were thinking about it as a guy writing this, right? As a kind of intellectual flex. And then I was surprised by just some of the messages that I got after with real displeasure. I went to an NEH seminar on the Civil War, literature and writing of the Civil War, and somebody mentioned Foster. So I was like, oh, I just wrote about him and gave him the article. And I was astonished by the chilly reception, because it didn't seem particularly inflammatory to me. But then to a lot of other people, it did. And I ended up not writing that dissertation about minstrelsy and writing a dissertation instead about the kind of visual culture of mass lynching and mob violence in the U.S.
For people who might try to find that article, can you tell us the title and the journal?
Yeah, it's called, the only thing I really regret about it is the title, which is in dialect. It's called Long Time I Travel on the Way, Stephen Foster's Conversion Narrative, from Journal of Popular Music Studies.
And as a former co-editor of JPMS, love it. So you both had scholarly backgrounds thinking about and working with Foster. What, in the last couple of years, what sparked this particular volume? Why did you choose the particular focus? Why is that important thinking about now?
The biggest thing is an upcoming anniversary that's particularly of note, and something completely coincidental that I think has really fed into this idea of Stephen Foster as the father of American music is that on July 4th, 1826, the 50th Independence Day, the same day that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died, Stephen Foster was born. And later biographers, you might call them hagiographers, made a lot of that, John Tasker Howard especially. So the same day that America turns 250, Stephen Foster will be 200. And it's, especially in my field of media history or journalism history, we think a lot about historical memory. Everybody cares about a centennial. Newspapers love a centennial or just some sort of event, a news peg to hang coverage on. But then that also makes that a site of intervention. That was a part of my interest in doing this. I just felt like it was something that should exist. This major anniversary is going to pass. I wasn't aware of anybody else doing anything major specifically about Foster. The Journal of American Music did a special issue in 2012. And as far as I know, none of the more traditional musicology journals have any plans to do anything specifically around the bicentennial. So for me, I thought it should exist. Jennie has talked about monuments, including Stephen Foster monuments.
Yeah, I've written about monuments. And when I started my dissertation, again, about mass violence and mob violence, there was one historical marker to a lynching in the United States. And it was in Duluth, Minnesota. And it was one of the strangest monuments I've ever seen. That lynching was massive. Bob Dylan grew up in Duluth and then in Hibbing, Minnesota, and has described basically being threatened by the specter of this lynching, which happened about 15 years before his birth. And when I got to that monument, what I found was a kind of a logoria, is the way people who write about monuments describe it, where essentially it's just word after word. And then you're reading those words and you're like, I still have no idea what happened here. There's a Gandhi quote, but there's no kind of like concise paragraph about the actual violence. And within a couple of years of my book coming out, there were a lot of markers and monuments, some that have a fair bit of abstraction to how they're made, right? Where you're still not sure what happened, right? But at least there's not a sort of conciliatory quote in it. And Foster himself, I've started thinking about him as a kind of monument. I've also thought about him because the statue of Foster came down so quickly in Pittsburgh. One of the things we will talk about on the podcast is the fact that, in New Orleans, where monuments started coming down in 2017, they had to be removed in the dark of night because there were people wiring car bombs for city officials' cars who had made the decision for monument removal. And with Foster, it came down without a fight. I've now begun to think about Foster. I thought about him initially as a hyper-canonical figure, that if you approach Foster, you are actually approaching the object that is the United States. And now I think about him as, to use a term that Philip Hendrickson uses in his book about racism, The Sons of Mississippi, he describes racial moderates as men with their back turned. And I've thought about that as a monumental quality too. So in certain genres of statuary, in particular Russian grave statuary, a person's back being turned to you in that statue is a sign that they're dead. So in a cluster of 5 people, the one whose back turned to you, they're dead and the other 4 are alive. And Foster is the man with his back turned in many ways because his politics are very difficult to figure out, if that's the kind of thing that excites you about music. And at the same time, it's just so hard to see his face. And now I think the reason is because his music is already in your body and mind. His sort of selfhood matters less. And I think that's why the statue came down so easily, because they were like, who's this? It's not Robert E. Lee. It's the doodah guy. And even though you've thought more about Foster in your entire life than you've thought about Robert E. Lee, because you've heard his songs, it was easy to remove him.
He's in the water, in a way.
Exactly. Like
someone like Confederate generals aren't. So,
right.
Yeah, that's interesting. So his influence is so assumed and pervasive that the memorial doesn't need to function in the way that something like a more traditional Confederate memorial does function, because that's a more presently contested space, whereas this influence of Stephen Foster on American popular music, it's there. We don't even need to think about it. I think it's really interesting that you're both also pointing to, I think in a sense, Jason, you were saying it's the 200th anniversary of his birth, the 250th moment of America, whatever. And I was thinking about, obviously, there's this going back to property, because that's one of the things at stake here, how he, like the American nation, is this theft and extraction. These are the legacies of both America and Stephen Foster. Thinking of them together is one thing, but it's also interesting too that even 2016, 2025, we're in such a very different moment. Thinking about your point, Jennie, in some ways, I was just thinking about how the kind of racial politics of the immediate post-Civil War era of Reconstruction, or even of like the 1950s, are so different now than this kind of grievance-motivated white nationalist movement. So it's interesting to think about how him and the problem he represents functions and sits in this seemingly new movement, new but not new moment of American racial politics.
What do you call it, Jenny? The constant racial reckoning?
Yeah, the ongoing racial reckoning, the conversation about race that we keep promising to have and not really having. And I think part of the reason why it's so difficult to have a conversation about what accountability would look like for racism is because we keep having it in public ways. And so I've thought a number of things over the years, but one is that an apology just definitionally happens in private.
Yeah.
Without that, it's a deeply weird genre of a kind of lawyerly apology, right? And I realized looking back at the article, I reference Michael Richards, Kramer from Seinfeld, having this very strange racial outburst, responding to hecklers on stage. I think it was around 2006. And I had completely lost context for that. I was like, what? Who? Why? And Don Imus as well is referenced in my first article because he had this. It wasn't an outburst. It was much more calculated. It was a day-to-day thing of racist language on this show. But there were these spectacles of apology that did not seem to serve any purpose besides the proliferation of more discourse. And I now think about it in the terms of the philosopher Jody Dean, who says we're in a moment of communicative capitalism where circulating the message is all that matters. Understanding it, reading it, knowing it, nothing changes. The most critically important thing you can do is just create more discourse.
And the apology form keeps white people at the center of the conversation about race.
100%. And I think, in fact, like so many of the discourses from 2015 onward were about white privilege. And I'm like, excellent. You have made white people the center of the universe in an effort to make white people not the center of the universe.
So how do you think the volume intervenes in these questions and problems that motivated you to start putting it together?
How does it motivate us? So one of the things I've noticed, and I joked about this with Jason, is that music studies got woke while I was while I was resting and not writing about Foster. So it has a very different quality, right? And one of the things that we found as we were approaching people, asking them if they wanted to be in the collection, they would quickly say, you should also ask this scholar of color. And I told Jason, I have really mixed feelings about knocking on somebody's door and saying, hey, would you like to write about this really racist document? So that we have a more diverse collection, right? So yeah, music studies became more interested in like diverse representations and diverse voices. And we do have that, right? We have working musicians, we have musicologists, we have popular music people, we have historians, mass comm, literature people like me. So diverse critical lenses.
That was something that was really important to us for substance, not just for the show of it. But I think at the end of the day, we would love for anyone that's interested in Foster to read this book, and we feel like it brings a very wide range of perspectives and disciplinary approaches. But to me, the number one audience for this book is the graduate student that's going to come along, whether they're in a school of music or they're a historian or they're in a critical humanities field of some kind, just so that they might have a resource that they can pull off the shelf in the library where there's no equivocation about the terribly racist content of many of Stephen Foster's most popular songs. But then we also are engaging with and wrestling with the enormous importance, the enormous influence, the fact that part of the popularity of these songs is that some of them are very well written and they're just really catchy. He's one of the original earworm writers, and he was all of those things. He contained multitudes in that way, to borrow a famous description of Benjamin Franklin. So the hope is that future researchers on Foster can have a single place to start from that it really encompasses the entire breadth. We have Kathy Haynes, who is the longtime director of the Center for American Music, wrote the foreword for the project. Dean Root, who I'm almost certain is the most prolific scholar of Foster, The only person I could think of that would compare would be the biographer from the early 20th century, John Tasker Howard. Dean Root did an appendix on research sources, just a great resource for how to find the sources to build your own research on there. Hopefully we're approaching a more comprehensive and what we're calling a more critical reappraisal of the legacy of Stephen Foster at the 200th anniversary of his birth.
And in some ways, too, like, I am very interested in a more geographical approach to Foster because basically the American place name is all over his writing, but he is a figure of the Ohio River Valley. So you'll go to the city centers of those various places and find really interesting records about him, strange documents, maps of where he lived. In Cincinnati, which I'm particularly interested in, like stadium building, which is the ultimate project that socializes the risk, extracting your money and mine to build something that produces private profits. Stadium building has just leveled the neighborhoods that would make Foster visible to you to help you figure out his relationship to the Ohio River and to industry in that area. So there's that ablation of space. And at the same time, there are parts of Foster's legacy that are just always going to be written on the map, whether it's the Mississippi River or the Swanee River or Bardstown, Kentucky is always making a claim for him. And I would argue that's what has made Foster last, is because in the 20th century, where a lot of pop culture became about immigrant performance and assimilation, that the map is very useful to the new immigrant who arrives in the U.S. And those place names are always compelling to people. Contemporary immigrants always describe the disorienting experience of arriving in an American grocery store and seeing all the options. But the early 20th century immigrant was, I think, far more interested in the geography of the U.S. And Foster is an instrument for that understanding. The sources on Foster are myriad. It's not just where he lived, but it's also the places that have remembered him. When you pull across the Georgia-Florida border, there are written on the welcome signs the sort of the notes of Swanee River. So to me, it's just fascinating to approach him geographically and spatially too.
Stephen Foster at 200 is a companion podcast to the edited volume Stephen Foster at 200, A Critical Reappraisal. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the book for in-depth, peer-reviewed research authored by our guests. You can also check out our website, stephenfosterat200.com, for more information about the book and links to more research from our guests. This podcast is hosted by Jennie Lightness-Goff and me, Jason Lee Guthrie. I am also the executive producer. Our intro theme is by Joel Corey. O Oksana, the Russian language cover of O Susanna you're hearing now, is by Dan Vexler. Logo design by Alan Z. Support for this podcast comes from a generous grant from the Music and Entertainment Industry Educators Association. The best way for you to support the show is by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts and sharing the show on social media.